She thought she was smiling at a broke old man with nowhere to go. She thought she was watching her husband finally cut loose the dead weight that had been dragging them down for years. She thought Thanksgiving dinner tasted better that night because they finally had the table to themselves. What my daughter-in-law didn't know was that I had already made 3 phone calls before I even reached the bottom of the driveway. And every single one of those calls was going to cost her everything she thought she owned. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who I was before that Thursday in November, and who my son had decided I was. My name doesn't matter much. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the county of Davidson, Tennessee, drawing up drainage systems and road expansions that most people drive over every single day without a second thought. I am not a flashy man. I drove a used Ford pickup for 12 years. I wore the same Carhartt jacket from October through March. I bought my lunches at the same diner on 5th Avenue North every Tuesday and Thursday, the meatloaf special, $4.50, because Vera behind the counter always gave me a little extra gravy. My son Derek knew all of this. He saw it growing up. He saw his father wake up at 5:15 every morning, pack a thermos of black coffee, and drive to the county office in the same scuffed boots. What Derek never asked about, not once in 40 years, was what I did with the money I made doing it. He never asked, because I think he had already decided the answer. His father was a simple man, a government worker, a guy who clipped coupons and complained about the price of gas. There was no mystery there. There was nothing to investigate. That assumption was the most expensive mistake he ever made. I met Vanessa at Derek's college graduation, which I paid for entirely. She had bright eyes and a firm handshake, and she told me she was going into real estate. I liked her then. I told Derek she was sharp. I meant it as a compliment. What I didn't understand until much later was that Vanessa approached everything in her life, including family, as a transaction. You were either an asset or a liability. The moment your column shifted, she acted accordingly. Derek and Vanessa got married in the fall, 7 years ago. Beautiful ceremony out at Cheekwood. I paid for the rehearsal dinner. I helped Derek with the down payment on their house on Elmwood, $22,000, which I wired to their account, without making a single comment about it. I didn't want thanks. I just wanted my son to have a good start. What I didn't tell him was that the house on Elmwood wasn't the only house I had a financial interest in. Over the course of about 20 years, I had quietly purchased 11 rental properties across Davidson and Williamson counties. Nothing extravagant, mostly 3-bedroom houses in solid neighborhoods, a couple of small commercial units near the Bellevue corridor. I used a property management company called Hargrove Associates to handle the tenants and maintenance. I kept my name off the public-facing materials, not for any sinister reason. I just learned early on that when people know you have money, they start treating you differently. And I preferred to be treated like a man in a Carhartt jacket. By the time of that Thanksgiving, those 11 properties were generating somewhere around $19,000 a month in net rental income. I also had an investment account that had been quietly compounding for 26 years. I had a financial advisor named Frank Delacroix, who called me every quarter, and who I believe was constitutionally incapable of delivering bad news, because every quarter for 2 decades the news had been good. None of this was visible to Derek. None of it was visible to Vanessa. As far as they were concerned, I was a retired county engineer living off a modest pension in a small house in Bellevue, which was true, as far as it went. I just didn't mention the other parts. It started going wrong about 18 months before Thanksgiving. Derek lost his job in the spring, not that he told me directly. I found out through a roundabout comment from Vanessa about restructuring and exploring options. Derek was in sales, had been for 10 years. And from what I gathered, the company had let a large portion of their regional team go. It wasn't his fault. These things happen. I waited 2 weeks for Derek to call me. He didn't. So I called him. He said he was fine. He said he had leads. He said not to worry. I didn't push. That was my mistake, and I have thought about it many times since. I should have sat down with him. I should have said, "Son, I know this is hard, and I want you to know that you and your family are taken care of while you figure this out." I should have said those words plainly. Instead, I waited, because Derek was proud, and I had always tried to respect that. What I didn't know was that during those months while Derek was job hunting, Vanessa had been doing her own calculations. Their mortgage was $4,200 a month. Their car payments combined were over $1,000. Their son Tyler was in a private kindergarten at $1,700 a month. The numbers didn't add up for long without a second income, and Vanessa, who was in real estate, was having a slow year because the market had tightened across the board. In August, they came to me. Not Derek. Vanessa came to me, with Derek sitting beside her on my couch looking at the floor. She explained the situation crisply and without emotion, like a contractor presenting a bid. They needed help. They were wondering if I would be willing to move in with them. Temporarily, they had a finished basement apartment and contribute to household expenses, help with groceries, utilities, maybe a portion of the mortgage. In exchange, I would have my own space, and they would appreciate the childcare help with Tyler. I said yes. I didn't hesitate. Tyler was 5 years old, and I wanted to be near him. I packed a reasonable number of things, rented out my Bellevue house to a young couple through Hargrove Associates, and moved into the basement on Elmwood. For 7 months, I was useful. I drove Tyler to and from school. I fixed the kitchen faucet that had been dripping for a year. I shoveled the driveway in January when we got 4 inches overnight. I contributed $800 a month toward household expenses, which Vanessa accepted without comment each time I left the envelope on the kitchen counter. I also watched my son apply to 42 jobs and get 11 interviews and no offers. I watched him start to disappear into the couch in the evenings. I watched Vanessa's patience thin like ice in March 1st at the edges, then spreading toward the middle. I should have seen what was coming. The signs were there. Vanessa started referring to the basement as your unit. She started scheduling Tyler's activities on days she knew I had offered to help, so that my help was never needed. She started directing conversations about house rules at me, with the particular tone of someone who is informing a tenant of lease violations. Derek said nothing during any of this. He had found a job in October, a lower-level position than he'd held before, and he was working hard to prove himself. I think he was afraid of Vanessa's disappointment in him, and I think that fear made him easier to steer. Thanksgiving was on a Thursday, of course. I had offered to bring pies. I had bought a pecan and an apple from a bakery on Charlotte Avenue, $17 each, wrapped in a box with a ribbon, and I carried them upstairs at 2 in the afternoon. Vanessa's sister Lauren was there with her husband Marcus. Her parents were there, Gerald and Diana, who had driven up from Murfreesboro. They were seated in the living room when I came up, and the conversation dipped slightly when I entered, the way it does when someone walks into a room where they've just been discussed. Dinner was fine on the surface. Derek carved the turkey. Tyler sat next to me and told me about a book he was reading about volcanoes, and that was the best part of the whole day, that small, serious voice explaining how magma moved through the Earth's crust. After the pie, Gerald made some remark about the house, complimenting the renovations in the kitchen, asking who had done the backsplash. Vanessa said they'd had it done professionally. Gerald said the place must have cost them a fortune over the years. Vanessa smiled in a way I recognized the smile she wore when she was doing arithmetic and said yes, it had been an investment they were committed to. Then Gerald asked Derek how work was going, and Derek, who had had 2 glasses of wine, said it was going well, that he was getting back on his feet, that the last year had been a process, and Gerald said, well, that's what family is for. And then he looked at me and said, must be nice to have the help. I said it had been mutual. Vanessa smiled again at that, the same smile, colder. After her parents left and Lauren and Marcus left, after Tyler was put to bed, I came upstairs for a glass of water. Derek and Vanessa were in the kitchen. I don't think they heard me on the stairs. Vanessa was saying that this needed to end, that the arrangement had served its purpose, that having me in the basement was affecting her ability to feel comfortable in her own home, that Tyler was getting confused about household boundaries, a phrase I had not previously heard applied to a grandfather who read volcano books with his grandson. Derek said something low that I couldn't make out. Vanessa said she didn't want to have the conversation again at Christmas. She wanted it resolved before then. I went back downstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed that had been my bed for 7 months, and I looked at the wall for a while. I wasn't angry yet. I was something closer to tired, the kind of tired that comes not from exertion but from recognition, the recognition that you have been misreading a situation for a long time, and you are only now seeing it clearly. Derek came downstairs the next morning, Saturday. He sat in the chair across from me, and he couldn't look at me directly. He said the arrangement had run its course. He said Vanessa felt that it was time for me to think about more permanent living options. He said he hoped I understood. I asked him if this was what he wanted. He said he thought it was best for the family. I looked at my son for a long moment. He was 40 years old. He had my mother's eyes, and his own particular way of holding his jaw when he was uncomfortable. I had watched that jaw for 40 years. I said I would be out by the 1st of December. He seemed relieved. He said he appreciated my understanding. He offered to help me look at senior communities. He had done some research. He said, there were some nice ones in Brentwood. I thanked him. I told him I had some things in mind. What I didn't tell him was that the first call I made that afternoon was to Frank Delacroix. Frank picked up on the second ring. I told him I needed to do a few things in the coming weeks, and I wanted to walk through them carefully. Frank was quiet for a moment. He knew my voice well enough to understand when I was calm and when I was calm about something. And then he said, tell me what you need. The second call was to Carol Myers, who had been my attorney for 14 years. Carol was a small woman with close-cropped gray hair who had drafted my will, my trust documents, and several of my property acquisition agreements. She had a way of listening to things without reacting that I had always found professionally reassuring and occasionally unnerving. I told Carol I wanted to review a few documents. She said she had availability Monday. The third call was to Hargrove Associates. I asked them to flag 2 properties for my review specifically, 2 commercial units in Bellevue that I had been holding for some time. Then I sat down at my desk and I took out a yellow legal pad and I started writing. Not in anger. I want to be clear about that. I have thought about that moment many times and I know what I was feeling. And it wasn't the hot, bright feeling of revenge. It was something more deliberate. It was the feeling of a man who has been patient for a long time, who has decided that patience has served its purpose, and who is now going to be precise. I moved out on November 30th as I had said I would. I rented a furnished apartment in the Germantown neighborhood, a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor, with tall windows and a view of the park. It cost me $2,200 a month, and I paid the first 6 months in advance without blinking. The building manager, a young woman named Priya, showed me the apartment and said it was a great deal for the area. I told her I knew. I had been watching that building for several years. She laughed, thinking I was joking. I was not joking. Derek texted me when I moved out to say he hoped I was settling in well. I replied that I was. I said I hoped we could have dinner soon. He said, of course, definitely, we'll make a plan. The way people say things that are meant to close a conversation. The first thing Carol helped me do was review the mortgage documents on the Elmwood house. When Derek and Vanessa had purchased the house 7 years ago, I had not simply contributed to the down payment. The way the transaction had been structured at my suggestion, and with their agreement at the time, though I suspect neither of them remembered the details, I held a secondary lien position on the property. It was a private loan, properly documented, in the amount of $48,000 covering the down payment and associated closing costs. The terms were generous. Simple interest at 2%. No payment required until sale or refinance. Those terms could be changed within the parameters of the agreement with 60 days written notice. Carol drafted the notice. The second thing I did involved Derek's employer. What Derek did not know, what I had never told him, was that the building his company operated out of, a 2-story commercial property on Charlotte Avenue, was one of my Bellevue units. I had purchased it 11 years ago through a holding company called Meridian Property Group, LLC. Meridian had a property management company. That property management company had leased the space to Derek's employer. Derek had worked in that building for 6 years. I did not interfere with the lease, which belonged to Derek's company and had nothing to do with Derek personally. What I did was instruct Hargrove Associates to begin the process of listing the Meridian Charlotte property for sale. This was within my rights as owner. The listing was public. I sent Derek a copy of the listing as a courtesy, with a note explaining the connection. I thought it was important that he understand it from me rather than from someone else. I want to pause here because I know how this sounds. I want to be honest with you about something. I did not do any of these things to hurt my son. Derek is not a bad person. He is a person who had been living inside a particular story about who I was and what I was capable of. And that story had made it easy for him to be led in a direction he might not have chosen on his own. What I was doing was not punishment. It was correction. I was revising the story to reflect the actual facts. The reaction came faster than I expected. Derek called me on a Wednesday evening, 11 days after I had moved out. I was eating leftover soup at my kitchen table, looking out at the park, when his name appeared on my phone. I answered. He asked me if I had sent something to Vanessa's lawyer. I said I had sent a notice of amended loan terms through Carol Meyer's office, yes. He asked what that meant in practical terms. I told him it meant the deferred payment on the $48,000 loan was now active, at the amended interest rate, with a schedule starting in 60 days. There was a long pause. Derek said he hadn't known about the lien. I said he had signed the documents at closing. He said he hadn't read them. I said I understood, and I was sorry the terms were coming as a surprise, and that Carol was available to walk them through the specifics at their convenience. He asked about the Charlotte Avenue property. I explained Meridian Property Group. I explained that I had owned the building since before he had been hired by the company occupying it. I explained that the listing was simply a business decision and had no bearing on his employment that was between him and his employer. Another long silence. He asked me why I had never told him. I said I had made a choice, early on, to keep my financial affairs private. I said I had watched what happened in other families when money became part of every conversation. I said I had wanted him to build his own life without feeling like he was standing in my shadow or waiting for something from me. He said that didn't explain why I had structured the house loan the way I had. I said I had structured it the way any sensible person structures an undocumented $48,000 transfer to a family member. I said it had been meant as protection for him as much as anything else. More silence. Then he said, Vanessa is really upset. I said I imagined she was. He said she felt blindsided. I said I understood. He asked if there was anything we could do to... He searched for the word resolve this. I told him I was happy to talk anytime he wanted to talk. I said I missed seeing Tyler. I said the dinner invitation was still open. I said all of those things because I meant all of them. Then I told him one more thing. I told him that the Bellevue house, the small house where I had lived for 20 years, the house I had rented out when I moved into his basement, was in my name free and clear, with no mortgage, and I had recently had it appraised. I told him its value, which was a number he was not expecting. Then I said goodnight, and I told him I loved him, and I meant that too. I think what people don't understand about these situations is that the money is never really the point. The money is a language. It is the only language some people can hear after they have decided they already know everything about you. You speak it not because you are cruel, but because you have run out of other dialects. What Vanessa had decided about me, that I was a pleasant, slightly burdensome old man who required management, was a story she had constructed from incomplete information and maintained through selective attention. She had decided I was a variable she could control. She had decided my presence in her home was a debit entry that had exceeded its useful life. What she had not decided to do in 7 years was ask me a single question about my life before Derek. Not once had she sat down with me and said, "Tell me about your work. Tell me what you built. Tell me what you know." She had seen the Carhartt jacket and drawn her conclusions and closed the file. There is a particular loneliness in being accurately invisible. December moved. I settled into the Germantown apartment with more contentment than I had anticipated. I found a new Tuesday-Thursday diner 3 blocks away. The chicken pot pie was nearly as good as Vera's meatloaf. I started walking along the Cumberland River in the mornings before the cold got serious. I called Frank and we reviewed the portfolio and talked about a few moves I had been considering. I called Carol and we updated some estate documents to reflect adjustments in my wishes. I thought about Tyler constantly. I missed the volcano conversations. I missed the way he said my name, Grandpa, with no modifiers, no agenda, nothing attached to it. Just the word itself, offered freely, the way children offer things before they learn to calculate. 3 weeks before Christmas, Derek came to see me alone. He arrived at the apartment on a Sunday afternoon. He wore a jacket I had given him 2 years ago, though I don't think he remembered that. He looked like he had not been sleeping well. He sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the park for a moment before he spoke. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said he had gone back through the closing documents on the house and spoken to his own attorney. He said he had looked up Meridian Property Group and understood now what it was and how long it had existed. He said he felt like he didn't know me. I told him he knew me. He knew everything that mattered about me, that I had shown up for every school event, had taught him to change a tire in a parking lot on his 15th birthday, had taken him fishing on the Harpeth River every summer until he was 12. and decided fishing was boring. He knew I made bad coffee and wore the same jacket too long and could not follow a recipe, but could fix nearly anything mechanical. He said he meant he didn't know about the money. I told him the money was just a number on a page. It didn't change any of the things I just said. He was quiet for a while. Then he said Vanessa had been talking to her parents a lot, that Gerald and Diana had opinions, that the situation had become, he paused, complicated. I told him I expected it had. He asked me if I would consider releasing the lien. I told him I would consider a lot of things in the context of a real conversation about what our family was going to look like going forward. He asked what I meant by real conversation. I told him I meant one where Tyler was not a bargaining chip and I was not a line item in their household budget. I told him I meant one where we talked plainly about what had happened in November and acknowledged it for what it was. He looked at his hands. He said Vanessa hadn't meant for it to come out the way it did. I said I understood that. I said I also understood what she had meant, which was that my presence had become inconvenient and she had decided to act on that. I said I didn't require an apology, but I did require honesty. Derek sat with that for a while. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said he was sorry, not on behalf of Vanessa, not as a diplomatic gesture. He said he was sorry that he had sat in that kitchen and not said anything. He said he had been afraid of Vanessa's anger, of the financial pressure, of everything feeling like it was his fault. He said he had taken the easier path and he knew it. I looked at my son, 40 years old, sitting in the afternoon light, looking like he had when he was 16 and had broken something he knew couldn't be fixed by anyone but himself. I told him that was the most useful thing he had said in a long time. We sat together for another hour. We didn't resolve everything. Some things don't resolve in an hour, and that is probably as it should be. But we talked in a way we hadn't talked in years, maybe in the way we had never talked, without the cushioning of easy comfort and assumption. Before he left, I asked about Tyler. He said Tyler had asked about me 3 times that week. He said Tyler wanted to show me a new book, this one about deep-sea creatures. He said Tyler had announced at dinner that his grandfather probably knew a lot about pressure systems because of engineering. And wasn't that the same as what happens to fish at the bottom of the ocean? I laughed for the first time in a long time. A real laugh, not managed. I told Derek to bring Tyler on Saturday. As for the practical matters, Carol and I structured a revised agreement on the Elmwood lien, one with terms that were fair to both sides and built in certain conditions going forward. The Charlotte Avenue property was eventually sold, though not for several months, and the transaction had no direct impact on Derek's employment. Frank and I had a good quarter, and then another good one. I bought a better coffee maker for the Germantown apartment, which turned out to be the single most significant quality of life improvement I had made in years. Vanessa and I did not become close. I want to be honest about that. Some distances, once traveled, do not fully close. We are civil. We are careful. We speak at family dinners with the measured pleasantness of 2 people who have seen each other's calculations and chosen, for the sake of something larger, not to revisit them. That something larger is Tyler, who at 6 years old knows nothing about liens or holding companies or the corrective power of financial architecture. He knows that his grandfather comes on Saturdays and listens to things. He knows that if you explain the difference between bioluminescent organisms and regular fish long enough, his grandfather will eventually get genuinely interested. He is not wrong about that. I think about what I would say if anyone asked me directly, if Tyler, years from now, sat across from me and said, "Grandpa, what happened that Thanksgiving?" I would tell him that his grandmother on his father's side used to say that the most dangerous thing you can do to a person is decide you already know who they are, that the decision closes a door, and sometimes what's on the other side of that door is just an ordinary life. Nothing dramatic, a man who wakes up early, drinks bad coffee, drives an old truck, and sometimes it isn't. I would tell him that I don't regret keeping my privacy for as long as I did. I was not hiding something shameful. I was protecting something quiet. There is a difference, though it can be hard to explain to people whose first instinct is to measure. I would tell him that the weeks after Thanksgiving were not my happiest weeks, and not my proudest, but they were perhaps my most honest, and there is something in honesty, even late honesty. Even honesty delivered in the cold language of legal notices and property listings that clears the air in a way that nothing else quite does. The park outside my window has gone gray now, the trees bare, The river trail empty most mornings. I walk it anyway. I wear the Carhartt jacket. I carry the thermos. On Saturday, Tyler will come, and we will look at pictures of anglerfish and vampire squid, and the particular darkness of places so deep that light has simply given up trying. He will explain everything he knows, which is considerable. I will ask questions. He will answer them with the confidence of someone who has not yet learned to wonder whether he is worth listening to. I will listen. That part, at least, I have always known how to do.